Listen, we know that you want all the best tips and tricks so that you can have the most magical Disney vacation ever. But here's the thing, not all tips and tricks are good tips and tricks. A lot of them are just terrible, which is why today we're talking about 5 pieces of advice that I've heard floating around the internet that I think you need to know about because they're just not good. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome to Disney's Hollywood Studios on a stormy day. Currently, tropical storm, well now Hurricane Debbie is making her way up in that Big Bend area. We're still feeling the effects down here in the Walt Disney World region, so things might get a little questionable, definitely a little bit windy, probably a lot of bit wet, although right now seems to be a good moment to be here. Anyway, we're gonna wander around the park, have a good time, and I wanna share these pieces of advice with you. So, what do you say? Let's go. Okay, let me start off by saying that one of my favorite things about living in the world that we currently live in is that we have access to so much information right at our fingertips at all times, which can obviously go either way, right? Like that can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, which is why we're talking today. Now, for the most part, I still think it's a good thing that we have all of this information available to us, especially because there are so many people out there who have questions that need to be answered. And there was a time where you didn't have access to an answer. Maybe you could call the place and get the answer you were looking for. Sometimes people didn't even know what question to ask. This thing we're doing here remedies that a little bit, and it does reduce a lot of stress for a lot of people. That said, we still have to be smart about the advice we're taking, and we have to shuffle through some of it, which is why we're having this discussion today. Like I said, 5 terrible pieces of advice that we're going to talk about. And the first one is that you don't need to carry a water bottle at Walt Disney World because you can get free ice water everywhere you go. This is a tricky piece of advice because there is some truth to it, but there's also more to it that you need to know so you don't find yourself in a position you don't want to be in. We're going to talk all about it here in a second, but first let's make our way into Pizza Rizzo. It smells really good. I know people don't really like this place, but I think it's great. And let's see if we can get our hands on a cup of ice water. All right, we got ourselves a cup of ice water. Cheers. Cold, delicious, does the job. So why do I think that this is a terrible piece of advice? Well, the biggest issue when it comes to these free cups of ice water is how available they are. Yes, they are going to be available at quick service locations. Some people say you can request a free cup of ice water at a popcorn cart. I have yet to confirm that. But the challenge is that this isn't going to be available to you when quick service locations aren't open. Sometimes, yes, they will set out a tray of cups of ice water. You can go in and grab as many as you want, but just as often, if not more often, that's not available to guests, even on super hot days, which we saw multiple times over the past few weeks at Magic Kingdom. This means you have to wait until around 10:30, 11 o'clock to be able to get your hands on a cup of ice water from most locations. Of course, there are some quick service locations that serve up breakfast, but it's much more limited than you might think. And that means that you're ultimately waiting until later in the day to even start hydrating, and that's just a terrible plan, especially if you're visiting Florida in the summertime, because it is just so hot. Quite frankly, you need to be hydrating as soon as you wake up and stay hydrating throughout the day in order to prevent problems. And yes, there are a lot of problems that occur thanks to the heat here in Florida, and just because people aren't prepared and they're not hydrating. Honestly, we see it a lot more than you would think in the parks. And I think that part of it is likely because people just aren't prepared, and some of it is probably because people downplay the severity of heat-related illnesses. It's really nothing to mess around with. So the best solution is to just bring a water bottle with you. And I totally get it. You don't want to carry an extra thing. I don't want to carry an extra thing either, but there are plenty of things that we can skip out on. A water bottle, some way to stay hydrated, is definitely not one that you should. Also, if you bring your own water bottle, oh, check this out. Never noticed these before. That's some Muppet Vision pressed pennies. If you bring your own water bottle, even if it's empty, you're gonna guarantee that you have access to water, because not only are there bubblers or water fountains around, but there's also water bottle refill stations that you can use too. So you won't find yourself in a position where you have to spend copious amounts of money on bottled water, which is also something that some people end up doing because sometimes the cups of free ice water have that Florida essence in them. You know, they just don't taste great. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Terrible piece of advice number 2. Virtual queue and lightning lane return times are flexible. Not necessarily. This is a piece of advice that when I heard it, I was like, oh my God, this is vacation ruining advice. So here's how it works here at Walt Disney World. Whether we're talking about virtual queues, Lightning Lane Multipass, or Single Pass, you're given a return time. And that return time is like a chunk of time during which you can return to ride whatever attraction that you're scheduled to ride. The policy at Walt Disney World is that this is not flexible. You can't show up early, you can't show up late, you show up during that time frame. Now, what if you show up after that time has passed? It's simple, you can't ride. So where does this piece of advice come from? Like, where did this start? There needs to be some nugget of truth here, right? Well, kind of. Every now and again, there are cast members who are a little bit flexible with this policy, and people have been able to get on an attraction after their designated time. But here's the thing, that's not a guarantee, and it's certainly not part of the policy at Walt Disney World. In other words, you know how you hear all of those people talking about how they show up a little bit late? Sometimes people even talk about how they show up like 4 hours late for their virtual queue and they still can ride. That's the exception, not the rule. And this is super important to keep in mind, especially if you're going to be visiting. So maybe there's a circumstance where you can't get to where you need to be when you need to be there. Can you go ask and see if they can accommodate you? Sure. But should you expect them to accommodate you? Most definitely not. And again, there's absolutely no guarantee that they will. They might, but they might not. And honestly, I can't tell you how important it is to keep that in mind, especially if you're paying for a Lightning Lane Single Pass. Because that's when we're talking about a lot more than just the inconvenience of having woken up at 7 a.m. to secure that Lightning Lane. We're talking about money. What is it, 20, 40, 60, nearly $100 depending on the size of your family on single passes, only to not be able to ride because you thought they were flexible? That's not a position I would want to be in, and I don't want you to be in that position either. So let's not take that piece of advice and assume that we'll get lucky and that they'll be flexible with these times. Let's show up when we're supposed to. Our next piece of terrible advice is that the only way to do Disney is to go rope drop to fireworks. Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart, that little piece of advice. And honestly, I don't think it's good advice, especially if you're here with a family. Look, rope drop to fireworks is kind of a general way of saying arrive before the park opens and leave when it closes, which is something you can totally do. It's something that you can pull off, you can manage, some families at very least. But when I said that this tip wasn't for the faint of heart, I wasn't kidding. It takes a lot of work to be at a park from before it opens until it closes, especially if we're talking about a park like Magic Kingdom that tends to open early and close really late. I mean, some nights Magic Kingdom opens at like 8 and closes at 11. That's a long time to be out, even if the conditions are perfect. Forget about in the Florida sun. But look, while it can be fun to muscle through an entire rope drops to fireworks day, it's really not that good of a plan. Meaning efficiency-wise. I mean, I do often recommend to start your day at the parks and end your day at the parks, but the middle part of the day not only is the hottest part of the day, it's usually the most crowded. And since that's when the lines are the longest, I like to use that as an opportunity to go back to my hotel, chill out, and gear myself up for part 2, especially for those really, really long park days like you'll have at Magic Kingdom. There's also a lot that you can do at your resort here at Walt Disney World, and honestly, there's a lot you can do at resorts off property as well. Though, of course, that's going to differ depending on where you're staying. Here at Walt Disney World, every single resort hotel on property has a long list of stuff going on to keep you busy if you do want to get out of the parks midday. And I'm talking beyond go swimming, which is also great because you can cool off. Things like trivia and games and lots of other activities too, not to mention all of the great dining options that you can find at the resorts as well. So there's a really good reason to leave midday anyway, and that's to enjoy the resorts, whether you're staying there or not, though you can't swim if you're not staying at a resort, so just keep that in mind. But there's honestly no reason to be in the parks all day long, especially during that middle part where it's super hot and crowded. Now this next piece of terrible advice is one that actually kind of makes sense to talk about right now, and that is the skip the line service. Currently, it's called Lightning Lane Multipass and Single Pass, but it used to be called Genie Plus, and before that it was Fast Pass. Anyway, this piece of advice is that you absolutely need that skip the line service if you're going to visit Walt Disney World. And you know, this is always a difficult one to discuss because everyone has different priorities on vacation and everyone's vacation looks a little bit different. But if we're getting down to brass tacks here, like we're getting right to it, you definitely don't need a skip the line service at Walt Disney World. You just don't. Now this is especially true when we're talking about Lightning Lane Multipass, which is the option where you pay for the day and then you can skip multiple lines. You know, you can use that Multipass for multiple attractions throughout your day. It's a little bit different when we're talking about single pass, but we'll get to that in a second. Multipass is a tool, and this tool, like I mentioned, allows you to skip the line, to have a bit of a shorter wait time at attractions throughout whatever park you happen to be visiting, although you can use it if you're park hopping as well. While this can be great for lots of people, it really isn't a necessity. You can still wait in a standby line. Yes, you will be waiting in a longer line, but there are plenty of ways to cut down on wait times. We talk about them all the time here on the channel. And of course, there are going to be a lot of you who aren't prioritizing attractions during your Disney vacation. Maybe you're focused on food, maybe you're focused on just ambiance and shows or whatever the case may be. A skip the line service certainly isn't going to be worth the money that you're dishing out for it, at least not in my opinion. Now again, there are exceptions, which again is going to depend on what your priorities are for your vacation. And those exceptions tend to come in the form of, at least in my opinion, Lightning Lane single pass, specifically single passes for attractions that have a virtual queue. So here at Walt Disney World, we do have a few attractions out there that in order to ride, you can't get in a standby line. You either have to have paid for that single pass or you have to get in a virtual queue at 7 a.m. If you're really dead set on riding one of these attractions, I think that a single pass can be a good way to go. Yes, it does come at an additional cost, but it secures your ability to ride that attraction. So maybe you're not great with technology. You don't know if you'll be able to secure that virtual queue. No big deal. You can purchase that single pass ahead of time and you know you'll be able to ride. Then you can try for a virtual queue and be able to ride twice in one day, which is pretty cool too. That's just not the same situation as with other attractions that do have a standby line. Now here at Walt Disney World right now, there are two attractions, well, 3 attractions that don't have a standby. One of those is going to be Tron Light Cycle Run. You have to have a virtual queue or a single pass in order to ride that. The other one is going to be Cosmic Rewind. Again, you have to have a virtual queue or a single pass to be able to ride that. Tiana's Bayou Adventure is a little bit different. They don't have a standby line yet. It is only virtual queue, but that's available as part of multi-pass, not single pass. So it's a slightly different situation. But unless you really want to secure your spot on one of those 3 attractions, I don't really think that Lightning Lane multipass or single pass is a necessity. It's a tool, it's an extra, but you don't need it. You also don't need it every day of your trip. I actually got a comment about this when we were talking about multipass over at Magic Kingdom, and I do want to talk about this when we do multipass at our next park, which I think is going to be right here at Hollywood Studios. Let me know if you want to see that by dropping a comment down below, or if you want us to go somewhere else. But because you don't need a skip the line service to ride attractions here at Walt Disney World, I definitely don't see the value in getting it for every single day of your trip. You know, I've been thinking about this again since I saw that comment, and I did respond to them, but frankly, if you're going to spring for Lightning Lane, I would do it once per park. And then of course get the single passes that make sense to you, you know? But I have a hard time recommending that if you're gonna be visiting a park multiple times, you need that multi-pass for every single visit to that park. Just doesn't make sense to me. All right, we've made our way to the front of the park and we have one more piece of terrible advice that I want to share with you. Honestly, I just want you to steer clear of this one, which is kind of the case for every piece of advice that we talked about today. But anyway, this piece of advice is that anything is a must try or must do. Now look, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great things to try and experience here at Walt Disney World, but I personally don't think that anything here is worth doing if it's not something that you're excited about to begin with. For example, Mickey pretzels, a classic treat here at Walt Disney World. Do I think it's something that you need to try if you're not into pretzels? Definitely not. Do I think you need to have it in order to complete your vacation? Absolutely not. Do I think it's fun and worth getting if you're someone who's excited about Mickey pretzels? Totally, but it's a case-by-case basis. There are a lot of people out there who get sucked into the hype of certain things here at Walt Disney World, which is great. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. If you want to get sucked in, get sucked in. I like doing that for any number of things, but especially when we talk about certain things like food and drink, that comes with a price tag, and that can add up really quickly and be super disappointing if you didn't enjoy any of it because it really wasn't for you, and you were hoping that this was going to be the pretzel that changed your life. It's probably not going to be the pretzel that changes your life. Some people talk about it like it is, but I assure you it won't be. Now, I want to make sure that I'm making something really clear here because I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm trying to say. I absolutely think that you should come up with a list of must-dos for you and your family, things you definitely don't want to skip on during your Disney vacation. However, I think you should do them for you, not because someone else says that you should. And that goes both directions, whether the recommendation is that you should eat there or that you shouldn't. Some places that people think you should not go to at any cost, I actually think are really fun. Pizza Rizzo is one of them. So, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to get at is don't let anyone drive your vacation. You take the wheel. But as you can see, we've made our way back to the Jeep. It's getting a little blustery out here, so it's probably a good time to head home. Although I'll tell you what, this is a beautiful time to be at the parks. I know it's not the most picturesque of days with all the clouds and everything, but the wind is really nice. It's only like 78 degrees outside right now, which is just, I mean, it's beautiful. And definitely a great little break from the heat that we've been having. And I mean, doesn't everyone deserve a break every now and again? But anyway, I hope that you found today's discussion useful and that it helps you sort through some of what might not necessarily be the best advice in the future. Of course, I'd love to know what you have to say, not only about the pieces of advice that I shared with you, but what are some of the worst pieces of advice you think are out there when it comes to visiting Walt Disney World, and some of the best. I want to hear them all in a comment down below. But for now, I'm packing things up and making my way home. Thanks so much for spending a day with me, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Until then, bye.